In this lesson, we'll be using the puppet tool to rig and animate the leash. Okay, so to get the puppet tool working for us, we first need to turn back on the visibility for the leash layer. So I'm going to do that right there, and I'm going to go ahead and grab the leash and actually pull the layer that was on top back up to the top of the stacking order, just because it's going to be easier to deal with it when it's where it's supposed to be. Okay, so we've got a couple pieces of the leash. We've got the buckle, and then we've got this piece of the fabric, and then we have this piece that's in the front that comes down and has the handle on it. So that's the one that we're going to be using the puppet tool on. The other ones are not going to need quite so much assistance as this piece here. So to get it started, let's go ahead, have that piece selected, and I want to set my puppet pins on the final frame of the head and neck rotation and position changes. So just make sure you're on that last key. We'll grab our puppet pin tool, and we'll go ahead and come in here and start adding some pins to our leash. And I'm just using the space bar to kind of toggle up the leash. And there you have it. Okay, so let's go ahead and we'll turn down this mesh so we can take a look at all of our pins. And what we need to do is come back to the point where the dog starts to stand back up. It really doesn't matter what the leash is doing before that because it's out of frame. So at this point where he comes down for the leash completely, that's where we need to move our pins to. So I'll start with this one, this one, this one, and this one. And we'll just pull them down kind of into place on his mouth as if he's picked them up. And then we'll start to just kind of coil them back and forth a little bit to make it feel like there's a little something kind of going on with the way that this leash has been laying on the ground. And this doesn't have to be perfect because it's definitely going to change, and you really aren't even going to be able to see it whenever it's out of frame. So just kind of getting it to look pretty close to real is fine, because this area is the area that matters the most, where it's going to be next to his mouth. Now let's make sure that this part here isn't in frame. And if it is, we can actually trim the leash, just because we are doing the zoom. It doesn't actually even need to begin before that. So I can just pull that leash back to not begin until that first key. So if we come back out to leash and bone, and I'm looking at this, it looks like we have a little bit of a problem with that popping into view. So let's see what's going on here. Part of the problem is that this has its collapse transformation, or actually in this case, because it's a vector layer, this is continuously rasterized. Its continuously rasterized switch does not really go very well with a composition like this one because it's nested. So if I turn it off and I come in here and I start to look at what happens with the puppet tool now, you can see that I lose those pins that I drew while it was on. But if I come out here, you can see it looks pretty similar to how it looked before. And that's just because having that on beforehand, it just doesn't like having that switch. So what we can do is come back in here. We know kind of what we did with the pins. We will have to add the pins again if you change the status of having continuously rasterize on or off. So what you can do is just select your mesh and delete that. And it's really good to just go in and completely delete the puppet effect at all. Now that we don't have continuously rasterize turned on, it's going to be way easier to fix this. So let's come back in and just add a few more pins. We're still on that same keyframe. We'll probably want to go to that last keyframe though, just for setting the initial pins. We know where they were. We know what it looked like. And we just added a few there. Now I'm going to come back to where he's at his lowest point and then just reposition those exactly the same way as I did before, just holding shift to grab them. And then just kind of coiling it on the ground. Great. So now when I scrub, it's just going to kind of go up to his mouth. Now we may need to change it a little bit so it stays in his mouth, because you can see he kind of moves forward. So we may need to move that forward a little bit as well. Very nice. Now we can change it a little bit, but now that's working way better. And now if we go back out to our leash and bone comp, you can see how now that's working, and we don't have to have that little continuously rasterized switch turned on for it. And it really doesn't look that fuzzy because we immediately start moving, and so having motion blur turned on for it is going to totally eliminate any kind of fuzziness you might notice just by not having that switch turned on. And by the time we're this far away, it's so far smaller than that 100% that you would be pushing it past by being zoomed in. You don't need that switch at all. So it's a kind of a nice little workaround by adding the camera movement, being in the side of the pre-comp and using the puppet tool. It's tricky, but you can make it work just with a little bit of finesse. Now, for me, I think that those puppet pins are moving a little bit too quickly. So what I'd like to do is actually come in here to my mesh, and this pin right here, I'm not sure where those are coming from. Let's actually delete this second mesh. We only want to deal with our first mesh. Okay, so mesh 1, that's the one that we're working with. Let's see if that makes a difference just by getting rid of that. Sometimes you may accidentally add puppet pins you don't mean to. So right in here, that looks like it just got a little bit too high, which is normal because there's no real mouth that we're actually aiming for. So let's just grab this and we'll pull that back down into place and see if that helps. I think this is working really nicely, except that right in between here, this looks like it's not really in the right place. So let's go ahead and pull that up so it does look like it's in his mouth. And just adding a few extra keys in there is really going to make a big difference. So now let's watch that through. Great. So that's looking really good. And now we can come back in our next lesson and animate the other side of the leash.